I'm Matt Elman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Greg Archer. Greg has been in English language teaching since 2010. He worked for 7 years in an international college, teaching Cambridge exam classes and managing the English language department. He's now a freelance author, teacher and teacher trainer, and is one of the authors of Complete Advanced.
Hello, I am Greg, and coming up in today's third and final podcast of this series, we are working towards exam day. We're going to be focusing on the B1 preliminary handbook and how we might think about using authentic answers that are given. We are going to be thinking about productive tasks and keeping the energy levels up as we move towards exam day. And finally thinking about maximising complete preliminary. Have we made the most of our course book? So here we are, we're at the third and final stage of our course. And I would imagine that your students, as would mine, are starting to get a little bit nervous, a little bit worried about exam day. Well, this is absolutely natural, and it's your job as a teacher to reassure them. How do you reassure them? Obviously, you can give them kind words and support them in terms of their emotional needs. You can also make sure that you keep giving them practice. There's a temptation often for teachers to get towards the end of the course as you move towards exam day and just give students past papers, exam practice again and again and again. I would really seriously avoid doing that because students need to continue practicing. They need to continue being productive in their language development. But we can really start thinking about the exam in a bit more detail. If you haven't downloaded the handbook yet, it is available from cambridgeenglish.org, and it's a vital part of the teaching toolkit at this stage. Why? Well, for many reasons, really. It provides you, the teacher, with support for your teaching. But I'm just going to focus on the fact that it gives you authentic examples of answers that candidates have written in the past. And these answers are given marks and comments by an examiner. If we look at the handbook, on pages 30 to 35, we have 6 texts. There are 2 emails, 2 articles, and 2 stories. They basically cover everything that the students might be asked to do on exam day. Now, by this point, your students should be more familiar with what the examiner is looking for. Hopefully, you've developed their awareness of the different criteria that they're going to be marked on, and not just language. As I said in the previous podcast, please make sure your students aren't just going into the exam room thinking, I'm going to show off my best vocabulary and grammar and I'm going to get a great mark. It's not just about the language they use. But if you haven't focused on this so far, now is the time to do it. So what would I do with the handbook? Well, these authentic answers are great to give them in class. You give the students an answer to assess and they give their own marks out of 5 for each of the 4 criteria. So they get an overall mark out of 20. So you ask them to read the email and they give a mark. Do this in pairs or groups or threes. They decide on a mark for content, for communicative achievement, for organisation, and for language. And they're really useful, these authentic answers, because what often happens is that the students see them and think, oh, I can do better than that. That's not the best answer in the world. And doing this in class also reinforces how easy it is to get 25% of your marks overall in the bag. 25% of your marks in this exam, the examiner awards a mark out of 5 for content. And as long as you can make sure that your students are doing what content asks them to do, in other words, answer the question, read the question, answer it, and do exactly what it's asking you to do, then they've got every chance of getting 5 out of 5 for content. When you're going through the examiner comments on these pages where the examiner explains why the email got 5 out of 5 for content, but only 2 out of 5 for communicative achievement, for example, you may have to paraphrase the examiner's comments. So it might be worth typing those out yourself to give to the students, because they are at a higher level than preliminary students will probably be able to cope with. But what it does is they start to understand what they need to do when they get in the exam room. Now, there's a second stage that I think is extremely useful for these authentic answers. What could you do after you've thought about what the examiner has marked it as and why? What could you do after you've considered why it got the mark it did? Well, there's a great opportunity for the students to be productive at this point. And if it's a text that has not got 5 out of 5 in all criteria, which in the teacher's handbook, they haven't all got 5 out of 5, you can give it to the students and ask them, how would you improve it? You could do this in class together if you have a whiteboard in your class, or if you have photocopier to give the students copies. You could all work on it together. What is a nice idea to do is to divide the students into groups and to say, okay, this group, I want you to focus on how to improve the language in this email. Only focus on the language. This group, I want you to focus on how might this person have got a better score for communicative achievement. And with this, you're building their awareness of what it means to get a higher score in the exam. The answers in the teacher's handbook are authentic answers. You could either write an example answer from scratch on your own, or you could adapt one from the course book. For example, in Unit 12, there's a story on page 113, and then there's questions after for the students to reflect on. And it says, work in pairs. Decide if these sentences are true or false. The story is about 100 words. It's well organised. The story has a clear ending. The ideas are connected using and, because, etc. And these questions are basically showing the students what they need to do to get a higher score. Now, the thing is, for this particular story, all of the answers to those sentences is true. This is a good example of a model answer on page 113. But why not rewrite it? You could rewrite it and put in some mistakes with the language, the vocabulary, or the grammar. You could rewrite it so that it doesn't quite make sense and the organisation isn't quite where. You could rewrite it and put in too much repetition. And then give it to the students and they can think about how they would improve it and compare it to the original. You could also ask the students to rewrite it and make suggestions for improving it. Okay, this is a model answer, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. There's always something that you can do. There's always some other way of expressing things. And if you remember, if you were listening back in podcast number 1, I suggested the idea of starting the students to build their skills in paraphrasing as early as possible. And this is hopefully something that you've continued throughout. And this example of a task is a good way to do it. There's also an exam advice box that tells you make sure you write a proper ending for the story. Try to surprise your readers. Well, you could ask them to rewrite the story with a different surprise at the end. So there's lots of things you can do with any text that you get, whether that's in the handbook or your course book. So I'm going to move on now to think about productive tasks in the classroom. Now, as exam day approaches, there is always a slight temptation, both for the students and the teachers, to get more focused and serious in class and to start thinking about going into the exam day with a really serious face on. But I think it's so important to find a balance between fun and giving them some sort of authentic exam style productive practice in class. The important thing is to decide what you want your students to be doing. If you really want to give them exam practice, make sure you stick to exam conditions. Make sure you stick to the timings that will happen on exam day. Always get them to reflect on their performance and make sure they know why you are doing the practice like that and what they need to keep in mind when they're doing the exam. As I mentioned previously, if you're giving them a listening test, you could speed that listening audio playback up, and it's more of a challenge. You could also give them slightly less time on a reading paper to kind of get them thinking about the pressure of the exam day. But that's the point. Keep a focus. If it's going to be authentic exam practice or as authentic as you can get it in a classroom, that's what your focus is. Otherwise, just make sure it's still fun, it's still productive and challenging. So, for example, you can still make speaking tasks quite fun, I think. So, on page 104, question 5, ask the students to work with different pairs. And they discuss the questions such as, what do you think are the best ways to save electricity at home? Which do you think is better for the environment, travelling by car or by bus, and why? Well, you can always have a little bit of fun with these, and you could ask students to kind of take on different roles for when they are asking these questions and answering these questions. You could ask one of your students, student A, be very negative in your responses. So, for example, what do you think are the best ways to save electricity at home? Oh, I don't think there are any good ways to save electricity at home. What's the point? Or you could ask student B to be extremely positive in their responses. What do you think are the best ways to save electricity at home? Oh, anything I can do, anything that anybody can do, like turning lights off, is going to be a good way to save electricity. And what you can do in this is that you're engaging them with a little bit of fun, because certainly at this point, your students know each other very well. And you don't want them to feel awkward or, oh, I've talked about this with this person and this person is my friend, so I feel a bit silly in giving my real ideas and opinions. So giving them a little role and saying be deliberately negative is a good way of getting them to focus on the language that they're producing rather than their own pure personal opinions. Also, when you're giving them homework, if you are giving them an exam style task, they should by now be following their own timings according to what they're going to be experiencing on the exam day. And at this point, absolutely stress to them that the main aim for homework, if it is a timed exam task, the main aim is not to impress you, the teacher, but to practice by themselves, to get used to being working under those time pressures. And peer assessment in the classroom is great. Really get them interacting and upgrading each other's work, their speaking and their writing, in the same way that you did with all the answers in the handbook. I use this constantly throughout the year, but this is really the best time to engage them in assessing what each other are producing, and because they learn things from each other. The monitoring and eliciting, all of the other teaching practices that you've been using since day one, should by now have enabled you to tailor your support to your students. Some will have progressed just as you expected. Others will have surprised you with their progress, and others will have found things more difficult than you'd anticipated and will need a bit more help from you. So this is where, at this point in the course, this is where you provide that slightly more tailored support to the students. And one final point is about maximising complete as a course book. Yes, exam day is approaching and you may think to yourself, okay, we've done the course book, we've finished the course book. But ask yourself, have you got everything that you possibly can from the student book or the workbook? Is there anything that you didn't find time to cover originally that you could go back to now? You know, there's nothing wrong with being on Unit 12 and saying, actually, let's go back to the reading in Unit 8 that we didn't get time for. Have your students covered all that material in the workbook? So have a look through it at this point. There's something in there that you passed over a little while ago. And another interesting idea is to get them to go back to a task from one of the earlier units and get them to do it again. So the writing that they did for Unit 2, give them exactly the same task now and ask them to repeat it. Because hopefully they've kept their work in a folder or somewhere, and it's really, really motivating for a student at this point in the course to go back to where they were at the start and compare what they produced for the same task. Because the odds are, by this point, their language skills would have come on enormously, and it can make them feel really good about themselves and more confident for exam day. It's always good to go back to points from further along. Review, recycle. It's how language learning occurs. Are there any extension activities in the teacher's book that you didn't get time for but thought, yeah, that could be useful, but you run out of time in a class? Now is the time to do them. Just because you've completed a unit, it doesn't mean it is complete. you can go back and do it again. Language learning isn't a linear development. It's a cycle, and you go back and you review and you revise and you recycle everything, and you get to the point where students become more able to produce that language. So that's what we want to leave it at. Hopefully everybody will be ready by this point. You've given them the support that they need, and they can go off with as much confidence as possible and have a really successful exam day.
Let's recap.
And so we come to the end of our podcast series, and in this final podcast of the 3, I've looked at the B1 Preliminary Handbook and how to use that, particularly with the authentic answers that it provides. We've looked at productive tasks, and yes, you need exam practice at this point, but how do we keep things still motivating and fun in the class? And we've looked at maximising complete, making the most of your course book, because what we're aiming to do in this final stage is to build the students' confidence in their final run-up to the exam, to extend their language production skills, and for you as the teacher to use all of the resources available to you at the end.
That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/completeconfidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.